Ladies and gentlemen, if I can ask you to look in the camera for 5 seconds, you can remove your mask for the photo. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. The Secretary General will update you on the meeting of NATO defense ministers, and then we'll have time for a few questions. Secretary General.
Good afternoon. Defense ministers have just met to address Russia's continued military build-up in and around Ukraine. This was a substantive discussion on the most serious security crisis in Europe in decades. Allies welcome all diplomatic efforts, and there are signs from Moscow that diplomacy could continue. But so far, we do not see any sign of de-escalation on the ground. No withdrawals of troops or equipment. This may, of course, change. However, what we see today is that Russia maintains a massive invasion force ready to attack, with high-end capabilities from Crimea to Belarus. This is the biggest concentration of forces in Europe since the Cold War. From the start, NATO allies have made clear that further Russian aggression against Ukraine would have a high cost. And we have called out Russia's actions, plans and disinformation. At the same time, NATO remains prepared for dialogue. It is not too late for Russia to step back from the brink of conflict and choose the path of peace. NATO has sent concrete written proposals to Russia on transparency, risk reduction and arms control. We have yet to receive a response. I reiterate my invitation to Russia to meet again in the NATO-Russia Council. NATO will not compromise on core principles. The right of each nation to choose its own path, and our ability to protect and defend all allies. We have already enhanced our deterrence and defense, with more troops, planes and ships, and high readiness of the NATO response force. These steps are defensive. NATO is not a threat to Russia. We do not know what will happen in Ukraine, but the situation has already demonstrated we face a crisis in European security. Moscow has made it clear that it is prepared to contest the fundamental principles that have underpinned our security for decades, and to do so by using force. I regret to say that this is the new normal in Europe. Therefore, today, ministers decided to develop options for further strengthen NATO's deterrence and defense, including to consider establishing new NATO battle groups in Central and Eastern and Southeastern Europe. And they welcomed the offer by France to lead such a battle group in Romania. Our military commanders will now work on the details and report back within weeks. Earlier today, we also held a regular meeting of the Nuclear Planning Group. Ministers considered worrying developments across the globe, including Russia's and China's modernization of their nuclear arsenals, and the continued risk of nuclear proliferation. Allies consulted on how to keep our nuclear deterrence safe, secure and effective, so NATO's deterrence and defense remains strong. Ministers also welcomed the progress made on burden sharing, with the 7th consecutive year of increased defense spending by European allies and Canada. This means $270 billion in additional spending on defense since 2014. And we welcome that the large majority of allies are now allocating at least 20% of defense investment to major equipment, research and development. This evening, we will discuss NATO's next strategic concept. I'm confident that when leaders meet in Madrid in June, they will reaffirm that Europe and North America must continue to stand strong together in NATO. Because NATO is the unique, essential and indispensable transatlantic forum for our defense and security. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
We'll start with BBC here.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. Jonathan Beale, BBC. You talked about new battle groups. Are those going to happen regardless of what Russia does? And can you give us a time frame of when we might see forces sent to Romania, Bulgaria, elsewhere? And then also, I think you just said, I regret to say this is the new norm. What is the new norm for European security? You say it's in crisis. You're essentially saying it's going to be in crisis for a long time.
Well, the new normal is that Russia has demonstrated that it really is willing to contest some of the fundamental principles for our security. The right for every nation to choose its own path, and also, of course, the right for NATO allies to defend and protect each other. They have actually suggested a legally binding treaty violating those principles. And they have used force, the biggest concentration of combat force since the end of the Cold War, to underpin and to try to intimidate other countries in Europe to in a way respect or to accept the Russian demands. So this is a new normal, which is violating core principles, which has been important for the security and the stability of Europe for decades. And therefore I regret to say that we don't know what will happen, but we know what has already happened. And that is that Russia has demonstrated a will to use force to try to coerce other countries and to try to change some fundamental principles that are important for our shared security. And that's the reason why we need to also consider more longer-term adjustments of NATO's posture in the East. I will not preempt any final decision. We have asked our military commanders to provide advice and provide more details on the scale and the scope, including of potential new battle groups in the East, in the Southeast, in Romania and the Black Sea region, and also other potential adjustments of our more longer-term presence in the East. But I think it's important to understand that what we now have launched, the work on a more longer-term adjustment of our posture in the East, our presence in the East, that is just one element of what we have done over the last year and months. After 2014, we implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense by establishing the battle groups in the Baltic countries, by modernizing the NATO command structure, by tripling the size of the NATO response force, and also by starting to invest more in defense. This has already happened over the last year since 2014. Then over the last weeks and months, we have, first of all, deployed more NATO troops in the eastern part of the alliance. More troops, more ships, more planes under existing authorities and structures under SACEUR. And that is to make sure that we are able to monitor, to follow what Russia is doing, and to also reassure allies in the eastern part of the alliance. That has already happened. Then we have also increased the readiness of the NATO response force, so we can quickly reinforce with even more troops and forces in the eastern part of the alliance. So it is not as if we are waiting for something to happen. We have already done a lot, but then we will consider a more longer-term adjustment, and we will have the advice from the military commanders within weeks, and then we will make decisions after that.
Reuters.
Thank you very much. Just a clarification. I know that the tasking is only just beginning, but these battle groups, are they likely to be similar to what we've seen set up in the Baltics and Poland? And as a second point, if I may, is this not the sort of thing that would antagonize Moscow and therefore should be avoided at this critical time? Thank you.
NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO is not a threat to Russia, and we have been clear for years and months that we are ready to sit down and also listen to Russian security concerns and to address issues like, for instance, arms control. If they are concerned about missiles and offensive weapons, The best way to deal with that is to sit down and engage in good faith in talks about how can we reduce the number of missiles. But that has to be balanced and verifiable. We have been able to do that before. It is possible to make agreements with Russia, not least on arms control. We have seen that with the INF Treaty back in the 80s, that actually banned all intermediate range weapons. That was extremely important for European security. Then a few years ago we saw the demise of that treaty, but that was because Russia deployed intermediate range missiles in violation of the INF Treaty. But of course we can go back to a regime where we ban categories of weapons if this is balanced and verifiable. We have proven before that we can limit the number of long-range missiles, and there are strategic talks going on between the United States and Russia. So we are not a threat. We are ready for dialogue, and we have put forward a long list of specific topics where we believe it's possible to find common ground and to address some of those concerns that Russia has raised. And we have no plans in a way to deploy offensive systems in Ukraine. This is what we are ready to do. But of course we cannot compromise on the core principle that we have all subscribed to year after year and again, starting with the Helsinki Final Act, and then in the Paris Accord, and then in the Astana Agreement, and many other times, all countries in Europe, including Russia and also the United States and NATO allies, have signed two agreements, treaties, stating that all countries can decide themselves, or have the right to decide themselves, whether they want to be part of an alliance as NATO or not. So what we do is defensive, but when we see this massive Russian military buildup, combined with threatening rhetoric, proposing something which is actually formulated as a kind of ultimatum that if we don't accept this and that, then there will be what they call military technical consequences. And we know the track record of Russia using force against neighbors, then of course we have to take that seriously. And that's the reason why we, in a defensive way, have increased our presence in the East and are considering to increase it further to make sure that there's no room for miscalculation or misunderstanding about our willingness to protect and defend all allies.
Tedef? Okay, that's Bloomberg, but Tedef is above.
Bloomberg, Natalia Drozdiak, thank you for the question. I just wanted to follow up on the term new normal. Is the concern that the troop buildup at this scale could be the new normal? Could you clarify that? And separately, I wanted to ask about the cyber attack that hit Ukraine yesterday and today, which according to Ukrainian officials is turning out to be one of the worst in its history. Does NATO have any evidence that this is tied to Russia, and could this be the start of a larger military campaign? Thank you.
So we have not seen any withdrawal, not any Russian de-escalation on the ground. We think actually it gives some reason for optimism, some cautious optimism, that they have indicated the willingness to engage in diplomatic efforts. But the paradox is that while of course this is something we think is something we should actually take seriously and see if there's possible to make progress in the diplomatic on the diplomatic track, what we see on the ground is no withdrawal of troops and forces, equipment, but actually what we see is that Russian troops are moving into position. And we saw the cyber attack. And these are the kinds of actions and measures that we expect will come in advance of a bigger military intervention into Ukraine. So of course this is of concern. And that's the reason why we continue to call on Russia to de-escalate and to follow up on what they say, to engage in good faith in diplomatic efforts. Yeah, I think that was your question, wasn't it?
Yeah, Tedef.
Thank you very much. Coming back to the issue of withdrawal. Now, there's word against word. You saying that Russian troops are still there and even Russia continues to escalate, while Russia claims the opposite. So my question is, why should the world believe what you say instead of saying what the Russian pictures also show? And the second question, am I right? You are still not sure whether to install those new battle groups, and it's still possible, if the situation changes, that you won't install further battle groups in Eastern Europe. Thank you.
So first, we have been very transparent, and the intelligence we are sharing is actually confirmed also with open sources, with satellite imagery from commercial satellites. So I think it's very hard to dispute that Russia has amassed well over 100,000 troops and a lot of heavy equipment. And this is actually something that was predicted by our intelligence several months ago. So what we predicted some months ago has actually happened, despite that Russia denied that that was the plan. So what we have seen so far is that we predicted a significant military build-up, and that has happened. Then we have never said that we have certainty about intentions. What we do know is what they have, the capabilities they have, the forces they have. But of course, we don't have certainty about what they will do with those capabilities. But this is the biggest concentration of combat-ready troops, with all the neighbors, with all the support we have seen in Europe since the end of the Cold War. And that is in itself concerning. Then what I say is that since there is no certainty on what will happen the next days and weeks, I'm saying at least two things. One is that if they use force, it will come with a high price. Sanctions will be imposed. We have provided, NATO allies have provided support to Ukraine, so they are better trained, better equipped, better commanded now than in 2014. And then, of course, we will also make sure that there is no room for misunderstanding, miscalculation on NATO's willingness and readiness to protect and defend NATO allies. But even if we see a gradual or some kind of development where Russia decides not to use force and we call on them to don't do that, just the fact that they have been willing to amass all these troops and combine that with a message that they are threatening an independent country and actually also threatening NATO allies, that if we don't violate core principles for our security, there will be serious consequences. That in itself is serious, and that's the reason why we need to consider some more longer-term adjustments of our posture in the East. But we have some time to consider that, because we have already implemented measures. We have already increased our presence. But that's more an immediate response to the current crisis. The other issue is whether we, separate from that, will have some more longer-term adjustments. Well, no final decision has been made. But I visited Romania on Friday. They are ready to host a battle group. France is ready to lead the battle group. And other allies have also expressed a willingness to be part of that. So there is a strong will, there is a strong readiness, but the final decision has not yet been made. We will make that based on advice from military commanders, and of course it will not necessarily be exactly the same as the battle groups as we have in the Baltic countries, but it's based on some of the same concept, multinational forces, NATO in the East.
Thank you very much. This concludes this press conference. The next session starts in 2 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.